Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm a futurist, which means I spend all my time focused on possible futures and what they might mean to leaders around the world. I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes focused in three key areas. The first is a look at the past, because I find it to be very instructive. The second is a look into these possible futures and what they might mean. And the third is a brief look at the pandemic and how it might alter the path. So let's start, as I mentioned, with a quick look into the past. The period of greatest human development is known as the Second Industrial Revolution. Many historians view that 100-year period as the most impactful for all of human society in terms of advancements in our standard of living.
A 100-year period between 1870 and 1970 that really transformed our world and set our modern standard of living. And there were three big things that drove this progression of human development. It was great inventions, like the telephone and electricity and the internal combustion engine. It was a convergence of forces that many believe will never happen again, but that convergence enabled this period. And then a series of catalysts that drove that convergence. And I'll touch on this as I go, as we think about the world today. But in the past, that was the biggest period in history in terms of our development. And this innovation wheel, which I developed, focuses on the outer edge, on our areas of well-being. And inside, you'll see just the sheer number of invention and human decisions and policy actions that enabled this period. Really a fascinating convergence of things that occurred over that 100 years. And we now enjoy the benefits of this period through our standard of living. But it wasn't always a steady path. It was bumpy at times. And in the 1920s, as you look at that list of events and activities and things, you should draw an analogy in comparison to today, because much of what you see here is happening again. And we know that the 1920s ushered in a period of instability for the world, really a down period for society. And the question I've been asking is history repeating itself? Are we seeing some of the same things occur again? And if we allow history to instruct us, we know that bad things occurred post this period, and we need to be cognizant of that and help it steer us in better directions this time if we are indeed seeing a repeat. And as you look at this visual, it tries to capture that 100-year period in the context of these areas of convergence, whether it's science and technology or politics or business or the economy. These things, events, inventions, activities, policies. It's just overwhelming when you look at just sheer number of things that were occurring in this period. And obviously from the 1920s forward, it just ramped as far as the number of activities. And this is just a subset or a snapshot. Now, if I were to zoom in on that subset or snapshot and just focus on that period that I was referencing before, we can start to see some of the similarities to our current day. So for example, you'll see a number of great inventions listed across this slide. You can also see things like tariffs and immigration issues, stock market crashes, even a pandemic, as we look at that period in history. And so again, this is extremely instructive for us as we think about what was occurring and what it drove in the years that followed. And so the question I ask as we shift to the future is, what is the canvas of the future going to look like? And this time it's probably not 100 years, but more like 30 or 40. But what are those inventions and human actions and activities and events like pandemics that will help shape this future? And the question then becomes, what are the catalysts that will drive it? And that has been a critical question, because the catalysts of the past were things like world wars and Great Depressions. And of course, we would like to avoid those kinds of catalysts. So I asked my global blog audience what they thought the catalyst that would drive human action and convergence would be in the future. And the first time I launched this post or survey was last year. And you can see some of the responses. The rapid pace of innovation itself was one of the key drivers. Climate change is an obvious one, but geopolitical instability and societal unrest also made the list. So you can see the list here. Then I thought, when the pandemic struck, that what would people think now in light of the changes driven by the pandemic? And so I asked this question again, most recently in the last month. And you can see a shift in people's perspectives and opinions. Climate change has climbed to the top of the list. And social unrest, not surprisingly, is now second. as we can see around the world, those kinds of things are happening. And they're happening for some of the reasons I listed on that slide before that were also happening in the 1920s. But then innovation is still on the list, and geopolitical instability, which is really a big one when we consider the China-US dynamic. They're all on the list, and some new ones. A movement towards a new world order. That Second World War established our world order, and we are starting to see some movement away from that order towards maybe a new one, and who knows what that looks like. And deglobalization is also new, as we look at the pandemic and what it might mean to what globalization has done for society in the last 25 years. So interesting to look at what people think about these catalysts. And there were others that they wrote in terms of their thoughts on possible catalysts. So very interesting as you look at some of the things on this list. But suffice to say, there are indeed going to be catalysts, and it's difficult, if not impossible, for us to predict what those catalysts will be. But we do know one thing. Science and technology are already converging. And this convergence is driving us to be adaptable and resilient in ways that allow us to shift with the world as it shifts. And the low code initiatives, for example, are a great example of how adaptability and resilience are achieved. But let's explore this convergence of science and technology. I'll do that by using a visual that I've used for a couple of years now, and that visual starts with a curve. This is the science and technology foundation curve. I picked a curve because I wanted to show that we can't see far enough into the future to understand exactly what's coming, but we do see signs. So the foundation of the curve is digital. It's an obvious one. It is foundational because everything else is built on it. And so we see these innovation accelerators emerging. And as they emerge, they're likely to transform our world in significant ways. But again, difficult to predict. And that's just the beginning. There are a number of other innovation accelerators explored throughout the labs of the world that at some point in time will have some impact. And again, difficult to understand exactly what the impact is. But we do know that there is an awful lot happening. These accelerators, if you will, are being tracked by futurists around the world. And this is just a subset of a list, but it's instructive in that it tells us why leaders around the world are struggling with this phenomena of pace, speed of innovation, and just the sheer number of things that are occurring. So let's take a look at this phenomena by exploring a couple. I'll start with precision agriculture, which is this notion that we can optimize yield in our farms by using technology. And so I'll start with a quick video that explains that phenomena.
With the weather, prices are up by 10 cents at the elevator.
Message to Walker. That's great. Thanks.
Go to Field 5 and aggregate all. Mark?
How are the boys?
They're working where we can't, and now we'll be on it all night.
They'll get it done.
Go with Solution 2, Field 5.
Solution 2, Field 5.
So the next one I'll focus on is virtual reality. And I pick virtual reality because it has both short-term impacts and profound long-term implications. The short-term impacts, for example, are on business travel, where the projections of a significant drop in travel driven by virtual reality is something that people are tracking. And with the pandemic, that scenario becomes even more acute. The bigger, more profound implications are described by Ray Kurzweil.
Once virtual reality goes inside our brains, and that'll be here by the late 2020s, and basically, I mean, my brain doesn't directly feel things. There's signals going into my brain. We can actually trap those signals and actually send into the brain signals representing a virtual environment. And so the computer will actually create the environment, and then we can be virtual actors in a virtual environment and do any of the things we do in real reality, like be together, hug each other, whatever, in a virtual environment. We can eat in a virtual environment and have that sensual experience because our brain is receiving these signals as if they were coming from the real world, but it's actually the virtual world.
What he describes there is a profound impact on what it means to live as humans. If the virtual and physical world blur completely, then it's be interesting to see how us humans respond. And it enables a scenario like the one that's listed on the bottom left there, where we might be able to virtually interact with our lost loved ones, somebody that died in our past that we now virtually can interact with. A real scenario that has a video that projects exactly what happens there. And the question is, if we could do those things going forward, would you? And so I asked my blog audience, again, that question. And interestingly, almost 50% say no, which I found to be the case in every one of these questions when I asked if they would do things like this. And so society might not be ready for some of this, and yet it's aggressively moving forward. The next one is the brain-computer interface. And this one's really impactful in that brain science has moved us to a place where these things are realizable, if you will. So I'll show a video that talks about just how far we've gotten in terms of the interface, the brain and the computer.
For the first time, a quadriplegic drove a race car with mind control. To enhance awareness, we built a very special car. Our innovation team combined EEG brain power technology with steering algorithms and track mapping.
O carro tem computador de bordo que traduz esses pensamentos para comandos efetivos no carro. Ele consegue atuar em todos os elementos mecânicos do carro.
Direita. Acelera.
So the idea of just moving an object with my mind is already the stuff of science fiction. But driving a Formula One car, that takes it up to another level.
Just one small example of what we're able to do with our brains. And in the future, interacting with the world through brain connectivity is something that will be very profoundly impacting society and the way we interact as humans. That whole paradigm of interaction will shift considerably to the point where we will ultimately be able to communicate brain to brain. And although these things sound like science fiction, it's really the sheer amount of progress that's being made that have many people believing these things at the highest end of this curve will be realized somewhere in the next 20 to 30 years. Now, as impactful as this curve is, it's the second curve that's most impactful. This is spawned by that first curve. So science and technology is enabling a number of scenarios that transform our world, individually impactful, but collectively really just change what it means to live as humans here on this planet. And so what I'll do is explore just a couple, and one being the autonomous vehicle scenario, which has gotten a lot of press over the last several years for good reason, as the mobility phenomena changes considerably. And two aspects are worth noting. The first is how we move as passengers. That scenario is already real in parts of the world, so we're not talking, again, science fiction. And it's not just really a passenger phenomena, as we're seeing with the pandemic, delivery is critical. Last mile of delivery and the automation that occurs there is going to accelerate as a result of this pandemic. And the second scenario that I wanted to focus on was automation and what it's likely to do to society. So this notion of an automated society and what it might mean for work and other things has been a critical talking point for quite some time now. And many believe that it's overblown, that we won't automate everything. I'm not so sure.
How about this? Yesterday, a robot taking a swipe at this, David, and what else would you expect here at the Waste Management Phoenix Open?
Really, that robot is called L-Drick.
How's this?
And both L-Dricks have done that at 16.
How about that? Only here could that happen.
And don't you bowlers get too comfortable. So automation and its ability to change our world is real, but we might say that, okay, those are left brain kinds of things. Those are things that we can see or envision algorithms taking over in the future, but we are human. And we have all these right brain characteristics that make us very different to machines, like creativity and compassion and imagination. And machines can't take that over, can they?
Oh my gosh, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Nice to meet you as well. David, you brought a friend with you here, and this is really kind of freaking me out.
Yeah, this is Sophia. And Sophia is a social robot, and she has artificial intelligence software that we've developed at Hanson Robotics, which can process visual data. She can see people's faces. She can process conversational data, emotional data, and use all of this to form relationships with people.
Okay, I mean, she's basically alive. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah. She is basically alive. Would you like to maybe give it a try?
Sure.
I'll
just say... What's... This is like... You can see how awkward my first dates are. It's a robot. I'm getting nervous around a robot. A very pretty robot. Do I just say hello to?
Yeah.
Hi, Sophia.
Hello, Jimmy.
Oh, my God. Do you know where you are?
Of course. I'm in New York City, and I'm on my favorite show, The Tonight Show.
Sophia, can you tell me a joke?
Sure. What cheese can never be yours?
What cheese can never be mine? I don't know.
Nacho cheese.
yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's not... I like nacho cheese.
Nacho cheeses. Ew.
Gosh, you did ew.
I'm getting laughs.
Yeah.
Maybe I should host the show.
Okay, all right.
A social companion or social robot such as Sophia could solve one of our greatest challenges, and that is the loneliness and isolation that our elderly feel, and this pandemic has obviously made that more intense. But a social robot like that could also start to encroach on those things that make us human. And so the question of automation then becomes a broader question in terms of just how much may be automated in the future. And if those two things in this visual aren't enough, this societal factor piece of the visual is a growing component. And interestingly, the societal trends impact the path of those two curves and are influenced by it. Just to look at a couple, children today get married much later, and that impacts a number of things like having children and owning homes. We are seeing a drastic fall in working age population across the globe, as you can see from the visual, and not having enough workers is actually a big consideration and challenge between now and 2030. The decline in fertility rates, almost down to replacement rate, and the aging population. So, for example, we now have less 5-year-olds than 65-year-olds for the first time in history. That happened in 2018, as you can see from the visual. And things like fake news or deep fakes, which are emerging, are going to challenge the foundation of society, which is trust. And of course, disease is a critical one now, as we can see from the pandemic, and it's not likely a one-time event. And importantly, we now have 5 generations of workers in our workforce, with Gen Z being the latest to enter that workforce, and it brings a series of challenges. A way to reflect the potential challenges that many generations represent. So together, what I've walked through represents the visual that I mentioned, and it represents our emerging future, the number of building blocks and dots that are connecting in ways that we can't predict. But as they do so, they shape the future. And unless we help coordinate, collaborate, and cooperate globally on how this moves forward, we're going to be victims of how this plays out. And so as futurists, it's our job to make sure people understand some of these dynamics and the system thinking required to really help move this future forward. So what are the implications of COVID-19 on this story as it emerges? What I've been doing is looking at this from two perspectives. One, the implications, which you can see across a number of domains what does the virus mean to these domains, and what are the impacts going forward? And so, for example, there's small things like, well, not small, if we continue to be uncomfortable in closed spaces, what does it mean to services like restaurants and movie theaters and sporting arenas, et cetera? What happens to renewable energies if revenue streams dry up in cities and the subsidies that go with it drop? What happens, for example, if we start automating much more aggressively because we've been exposed as far as our humanness and our inability to support the work that's required in a pandemic scenario? And what happens if through contact tracing and other means, we start evolving towards a surveillance state much more aggressively? But with every one of these implications comes a set of responses. And as a society, we can't possibly know where these things go. So this is not a series of predictions. This is a series of scenarios that represent possible responses in each of these domains. So for example, will we accelerate towards digital learning? And we're already seeing that through necessity. But does it become something that stays with us, where we're moving from the current learning paradigm to a learning paradigm centered on digital? Another good example would be the supply chain conversations that are going on right now, and the globalization phenomena really reversing itself. And now the trade-off of efficiency for resilience is a critical discussion. Do we move away from efficiency and towards resilience? And do we automate to avoid the cost implications of doing so? A great example of potential issues going forward is this notion that we don't want to come into contact with things in the future. So the acceleration of contactless interfaces becomes something that's really possible. And then lastly, work. What happens if this remote work phenomena is embraced on a larger scale? And this whole question of work is a really interesting dynamic, because it's a great example of how one domain, work, impacts and influences a number of different domains. So for example, if you look at this visual, what happens if we reverse the process of urbanization because we no longer feel comfortable in cities? And we're already seeing that play out. What happens if workers can be anywhere? The pool of talent, it becomes much bigger, but the city structures that we have learned to live with may reverse. What happens if the real estate footprint shrinks because we're no longer in need of all that office space or retail space for that matter? What happens to the retail arena? And this is all work driven, right? Immigration backlash. What happens if we continue to see the backlash against immigration, and that drives automation, because now we've seen how exposed we are when essential workers are immigrants and they're no longer available to do that essential work. And with all of this is also the notion of the future of work. Where does work go as it moves from a point of connectedness all the way through the need for resilience and adaptability? This is a journey. It's not a linear process, but it is a step in the direction of the future of work. And things like working from anywhere, and that accelerates because of this pandemic. Things like the next generation of productivity, which we've had the power to drive for years now, accelerates because of the pandemic. Our hybrid workspace phenomena is going to accelerate. So it's not going to be all remote work. We will be in offices, but the office space looks very different in the future. And virtual reality kicks in at a higher level. And ultimately, where we land is this notion of resilience and adaptability. And an asset-light footprint is a great way to get there. And this is the journey towards the future of work. It's very similar to what I just viewed, but it's in a journey format. And one of the most critical pieces of the journey is this notion of new era attributes. The characteristics of our organizations have to reflect these. In doing so, positions us to thrive in this emerging future as opposed to being disrupted by it. And I'll close with the notion of the future of business, the same kind of view, but this view says that at the heart of our business is an adaptive core. We provide a link to our capabilities so that the edge of our business is facilitated, and that's where most business is conducted today. And ultimately, we will operate in a world of ecosystems, horizontal in nature, but stakeholders exist across the landscape, not just within our business. So the collaborative nature of how we operate in the future is critical. And so moving towards this journey, if you will, towards the future of business becomes very, very critical. And something that every organization needs to be focused on to address all of the things that I've talked about in the future. So with that, I'll close with this quote, which I find to be the best quote I've come across, and that is that the future is all about those who can learn, unlearn, and relearn. And unfortunately, it's the toughest thing, unlearning, that is, for us humans to do. But it is critical for us if we are to succeed and thrive in this emerging future. And our right brains for the foreseeable future will remain dominant and has to be something that we all think about as we operate in this future. So with that, I thank you and welcome you to join me in the conversation at my blog, which you can see there. So thank you very much.